Hello, everyone. Calling the meeting to order. Could we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Haw,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson,
Most people are still on mute, so
Yeah, I see
Present.
it.
Mr. Dantz,
Here.
Mr. Gentili,
Here.
Mr. Bergstrom,
Here.
Ms. Goodman,
Here.
Mr. Suda.
Here.
Okay. Has everybody had a chance to approve or review the agenda, or has everybody got a copy of the agenda and had a chance to review it? Any comments, changes?
this is Barry. I would like to add under new business, the 3 additional grant agreements that I emailed out this morning. 2 being for the MDOT marketing and capital improvement grants, and the 3rd being the CARES grant.
Okay.
What is the CARES grant?
It's the $30,000 that we were awarded through the CARES program back in, I don't know, that was probably April when word came through on that. This is the paperwork that the state has put together for it.
Okay. How much money is that?
$30,000.
30,000. Okay.
Okay. Do I hear a proposal to add that to the agenda?
So moved.
Okay. Do I hear a second?
Support. Bergstrom.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Gentili,
Yes.
Ms. Goodman,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Dantz,
Yes.
Mr. Haw,
Yes.
Mr. Bergstrom,
Yes.
Mr. Suda.
Yes.
Okay. Public comment. I can't see everybody who may be sitting with some of the other folks here at the meeting, but if there is any public out there, if they have a comment, welcome to make it at this moment. I hear none, so we'll move on. Next is approval of the minutes for the the June 15th meeting. Everyone, I hope, has gotten a copy of the minutes and has had a chance to review it. Any changes, comments? If not, could I hear a second to approve it? Or a motion to approve it?
Second.
Okay. Julie?
Do we have a,
Oh,
did anybody make the motion?
I'll make the motion.
Okay. And Mark, you still have your second on it?
Yep.
Julie, we're all set for a roll call then?
All right, Mr. Suda,
Yes.
Mr. Dantz,
Yes.
Mr. Haw,
Yes.
Mr. Bergstrom,
Yes.
Ms. Goodman,
Yes.
Mr. Gentili,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson.
Yes.
Okay, moving on. Next item, treasurer's report. June 2020 accounts payable. I hope everybody has gotten a copy of that, has a chance to review it. Any comments by the board? Concerns?
I guess the comment I will add, if you notice the relocation costs, 44,000, a relatively large item. That is the final payment in our land acquisition, covering relocation costs and any other trailing items there. That will be reimbursable as soon as I get the paperwork for reimbursement submitted on that. But that's where that large item is coming from and why you see it there.
Thank you, Barry. I was going to ask that question. And I was going to ask also whether that was the end of it. So you've answered all that stuff.
Yep.
Any other comments, questions? If not, do I hear a motion to approve the June 2020 accounts payable as presented?
So moved. Bergstrom.
Okay, do I hear a second?
I'll
Second.
that.
Okay. Julie, can we have a roll call, please?
Who was the second? Peterson?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Dunn,
Yes.
Mr. Bergstrom,
Yes.
Mr. Suda,
Yes.
Mr. Haw,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Gentili,
Yes.
Ms. Goodman.
Yes.
Okay, the next item is the June 2020 revenues and expenses report, financial statement, and the trial balance sheet. I presume everybody's had a chance, has had a copy of that and has had a chance to review it. Any comments, questions? If not, could I hear a proposal to approve it as presented?
So moved.
I'll second it. Julie, can we have a roll call on that, please?
Mr. Gentili,
Yes.
Mr. Suda,
Yes.
Ms. Goodman,
Yes.
Mr. Bergstrom,
Yes.
Mr. Haw,
Yes.
Mr. Dunn,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson.
Yes.
Okay, moving on. Next item of business is committee reports and discussion. There was no executive committee meeting since our last meeting. No budget committee meeting since our last meeting. And no capital projects committee meeting since our last meeting. So we'll move on to airport director's report. Barry, it's all yours.
Okay. Just realized I didn't bring up the other documents as we were talking through them. Sorry about that. Let me bring up my report. Okay. All right, I hope you are seeing my report.
Yes, I am, Barry.
Report Director Jan.
So no accidents or incidents in the month. We talked a little bit about this in approving the agenda. Under new business is the CARES Airport grant that we've received the paperwork for. The next item here is EAS eligibility. I mentioned this last month, and I will probably keep mentioning it until hopefully it becomes a non-issue. But under current federal rules or federal statutes, we need to have about 3,500 passengers, and that's total passengers, both either boarding or just deplaning this calendar year, or we are no longer in the Essential Air Service program. There's a formula, and that's what that would equate to us. Normally, we're not even close to those numbers, but with the COVID and everything else going on, and also kind of a poor start to the year with service, we're right now not looking like we will make that number. there are a number of other airports that will be in the same situation. When this has been discussed by DOT in the past, they are anticipating Congress will adjust or relax the rules due to COVID. But if that doesn't happen, we are basically out of commercial air service after this year under the current rules. So just again, just an FYI, there's not a lot we can do. I mean, obviously we can start lobbying, but it's a national issue that needs to get addressed at some point. So sorry, Jerry, I cut you off.
I was going to say, is that end of this year, meaning December 31st, 2020? Or
Yes, the way it is they do by calendar year when they total up the enplanements.
okay. But I mean, for cutting off the service. Yes.
There most likely would be a significant delay between the triggering act, which would be the annual enplanements, and the ending of service, just because everything takes time for the bureaucracy to process. But that would be the triggering event.
So really, the end of the calendar event means we're out for sure next year then.
Again, because this impacts airports nationwide, everyone is believing that Congress will at some point in some subsequent either, I can't even think of the term of the bills they're putting out that are trying to sustain the economy, that in one of those they will amend this either temporarily or possibly permanently, but that hasn't yet happened, as there are, bigger fish to fry right now in the nation than this particular issue.
Okay, well, that's good to know. And there's a lot of small airports out there, so I guess that's a pretty significant group to deal with too. So.
And there is a distribution of small airports across most states, so therefore it is something that impacts most states, and therefore generally it is something that consensus can be built around at the congressional level.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I don't have any updates on the fuel system monitor. August airfares, or my airfare report for July, but looking at travel in August. Again, as last month, I'm now including, oops, that didn't highlight very well, this fifth column, which is Cape Air's existing service into Quincy, Illinois, that goes through Chicago O'Hare as well with an American Airlines code share. So we can kind of hopefully see where Cape Air and American price things, hopefully on a very comparable basis to what we will be seeing, knock on wood, when service starts here October 1st. But you'll see that, well, in general, fares are very low right now. And I think this also ties into kind of the next page in my notes, which talks about our passenger numbers for June and kind of where things look like they are heading in July. It is interesting, as the economy started reopening in May, there's a report that TSA puts out every day that shows the number of passengers they screened nationwide the prior day. So you can kind of see nationwide where we are kind of in a recovery. And back in May and June, each week we were gaining about 100,000 passengers a week over the previous week. And that's out of a number of typically around, an average is about 2.5 million passengers each day nationwide. And we were kind of seeing 100,000, improvement a week off of numbers that in the middle of April were less than 100,000 total passengers nationwide. So you kind of start extrapolating from that. It's like if we're improving 100,000 a week, we've got, 25 weeks, so therefore in about 6 months, if that trend were to continue, things could get back to normal. But what has really happened after the 4th, and as the virus starts kind of impacting other areas of the country than where it kind of started back in March and April, we're really seeing now that level of improvement has leveled off. And if anything, it might be decreasing slightly. 4 or 3 of the last 4 days were down versus the comparable days a week ago. So, and where we are right now is about 25 to 30% of normal of where we were a year ago. And our local numbers are kind of seeing the same thing. So I'm going off on a tangent here, but as a result, the air carriers who were, I think, being a little more optimistic with a return of more travelers this summer are now going back to significantly cutting fares, trying to stimulate air travel. And we're really seeing that across the board here. I mean, the average fare out of Traverse City for these 20 destinations at around $185 it's never been that low. In looking at the average fare out of Midway on Southwest, pretty much you could get anywhere that Southwest flies out of Midway for $90 round trip. Things are very inexpensive to fly right now, and we kind of see that across the board here. 185 average, Grand Rapids 170 average, Quincy, Illinois, that Cape Air City 186 average. Muskegon typically is not as competitive. United does not price very aggressively out of there, more expensive. Ours, even though Southwest is very cheap, as I mentioned, out of Midway, most of their flights are $90. You take that $90 on top of our round trip to Chicago of 158, which in all other times is a good deal, but 158 plus 90 gives you that kind of 250 range, and some are a little bit higher, and that therefore that number is, our number is higher. So it's a very interesting market right now. So
In fact, I've noticed, I heard on TV in the last couple of days, Southwest has been advertising $49 fares, but it doesn't say where, and it doesn't say from where.
they're pretty much all over the place. And
Oh, okay.
when I was putting this together, they were generally, when Southwest advertises, those are one way. But I was seeing most of what I was seeing was actually $45 out of Midway.
Okay.
So, any questions on airfares and kind of the landscape right now? Hearing none, moving on to our passenger numbers. So again, this summarizes a couple of the points that I was talking about earlier. For the month of June, obviously you see a ramp up. June was our busiest month of the year so far, but that still equates to about 35% of normal for June, but significantly better than April and May, and even the first part of the year. But you see that total number through the first 6 months of the year, first half of the calendar year, only a total of 743, and we need about 3,500. Now, obviously, our best months are July, August, and into the fall, but it's a stretch to think that we're going to get, close to 3,000 passengers the second half of the year to make the number without needing some relief from Congress on those issues.
Right, looking at those numbers, Barry, I'm gonna say that we're looking at 2,000 to 2,200, 25 tops for the year.
I would say 2,500 to 2,700, just
Okay.
because in July we'll see 600. August, if it doesn't start contracting again, we should see a similar amount. In September, you've got the holiday, Labor Day, which is always a good weekend. And then I'm hopeful that we'll see an uptick with the new carrier, people just wanting to try it out, hopefully, and some of the marketing push around that through the last quarter. So I'm optimistic that we can be north of 2,500, but I don't see a path right now that gets us to 3,500 without the economy significantly improving or people's fears significantly receding.
So I'm going with your estimates for right now.
Okay.
Better than mine.
On the performance, we did have 3 canceled flights last month, although realistically, I would consider only one of them a canceled flight. The other 2 were a day where we had 2 round trips scheduled and they combined them into one, partly because we didn't have yet the 1900 in service and that just was more convenient, but you know, there was no need to have all of those seats flying because we just don't have those passenger numbers right now. But in general, the airline, the current carrier, has been performing very well, and I will talk a little bit more about that later. Any questions on where we stand with passenger numbers and performance? Hearing none, I'll move on to capital projects update. So last month in this meeting, we completed the runway resurfacing, the bulk of the project, but there were a couple loose ends that still needed to get finished. The final markings need to happen at least 30 days after the asphalt is laid down. That happened just before the 4th of July. And actually, no, that happened just after the 4th of July. And then there was a little kind of add-on project here, some additional signs that got installed that came up during our airport inspection last December. And we added those into the project as a funding mechanism. And those got installed same time frame that those final markings were done. So at this point, everything is completed and the final paperwork is being processed to close out that grant. This year's project, which is our ALP, our airport layout plan update, I'm still waiting on MDOT Aeronautics Commission to approve the grant for that project so that it can essentially get started. That was supposed to happen at the Aeronautics Commission meeting this month. I haven't been told whether we made it onto the agenda or not with our grant request. If it doesn't happen this month, it would happen the next meeting, which is in 2 months in September. And then I've been updating the board about this special grant that Eagle and MDOT have been working on that the state legislature last fall approved additional funding for, basically testing at all airports for PFAS. And there was a grant submittal deadline on that at the end of May. We, through our consultant, Prina Newhoff, put together a proposal. That proposal was accepted, and we are waiting for the grant paperwork or contract on that as well. So as it relates to air service, I've touched on some of these things, but in general, all I can say is I wish Public Charters / Ultimate Jet had done the things 2 years ago as they were promising with regards to service in the 1900, because now that it is here and operating, everything has been going very smoothly. Other than the fact that, we've got a pandemic that's depressing demand, we're actually offering very good, reliable service this summer, and it's just a shame that there aren't as many people available to enjoy it. The Beach 1900 did come online on Thursday, June 25th, and has been operating since then. It operates four flights a week on the 4 days that we have 2 flights a day, and the Dornier Jet operates 1 flight a day, 7 days a week. So that's kind of our summer schedule. Both aircraft are there to cover for the other one if there's any sort of issue. Haven't really needed to use that yet. So things are going well from that standpoint.
Well, we've waited a long time for that. That's good news.
Well, yeah,
Yeah, I know it.
a little too late, but it is what it is. I did touch on kind of the national average of 25%, which is kind of what we're seeing right now, kind of towards the end of July. Over the 4th of July, though, we were at about 50% of prior year. We had actually some, very good days of passengers coming in before the 4th and leaving after the 4th, as we normally do. Still down, but better than kind of the run rate for, I think, the rest of summer. I think I mentioned this last month, and I'll repeat it again because it's interesting, is generally no one is booking far out in advance. People are booking very close in, often a week or even less. I mean, it's common right now to see people booking day of or for the next day for their travel, which was really unheard of prior to the current environment. But it makes sense that people aren't committing to doing anything, as there's just still too much unknown, especially when it comes to air travel and traveling. I'm expecting that overall our July numbers, you average that 50% over the 4th with less than that the rest of the month. I think will be about 40% of prior year come the end of July. And I already talked about the nationwide numbers, so I need to repeat that again. We are still waiting on DOT to make their final award for service in our Essential Air Service selection process. I've had multiple conversations with them. I've been talking to them about once a week. And one of the things I sent to you this morning caused a slowdown in the process. But on July 1st, which when I was talking to DOT at the end of June, they were hopeful of getting out the award before the 4th of July. That was their goal. They just wanted to get it out because things slow down around the 4th and after. They just wanted it done before that. But on July 1st, Boutique submitted a letter to DOT basically alleging impropriety in the bidding process and requesting that Cape Air's bid be thrown out and that DOT select from the remaining bidders. Everyone I've talked to, both at DOT, around here, at Cape Air, thinks this is really an unwarranted, or there's no merit in these allegations. And basically what Boutique is claiming is that it is inappropriate for a company like American Airlines to submit a letter that basically says if another carrier is selected, that they will promise to do a code share with that airline, in this case, Cape Air. That has been common practice forever. Cape Air Americans always done this on Cape Air bids. JetBlue does it for Cape Air bids. I recall seeing United doing it in the past, a while back, maybe 10 years or so ago. So there's nothing really unusual about this, but Boutique is now suddenly claiming foul, and what really bothered me about this was the timing. If Boutique had come in, immediately after the board here had made its selection and kind of the close of public comment, and at that point had raised this as a rejected early in the process. But no, they wait nearly 2 months, and then as DOT's just about ready to award, they then throw in a wrench into the mix. Because it's what Boutique has done is very public, DOT needs to address it. They just can't ignore it. So their lawyers have been meeting and trying to figure out the language they're going to use to address Boutique's claims and concerns, which is why we're still now the 20th and don't have a award, even though DOT had intended to get it done before the 4th. So I don't know what Boutique really hoped to accomplish by this. I think they just really ticked more people off, both at the DOT and throughout. But that is where that stands. Does anyone have any questions on that?
What do you think is going to happen? Think this thing will just float through?
When talking with DOT, they can't verbally commit to anything because ultimately the formal award letter is the document that is obviously what carries the weight of their decision. But informally, it was really just described to me as a hiccup in the process, but unfortunately something that delays the process. If you look at the clock, or I should say the calendar, we're coming up on the end of July. October 1st is really just 2 months away, which is not a lot of time once an award is awarded to really get everything in place to get service up and running seamlessly on day one. But that's unfortunately where we're being placed. So no, I don't think it's anything that's going to cause too much concern, but it is this hiccup.
When I read that letter after you sent it out this morning, my thought was that hands down, the presentation by Cape Air was just better, more professional. They seem better qualified to take on the position and job. So is there anything we as a board can do to attest to that fact? And that the letter from American Airlines really didn't influence our decision, I don't think.
When I've asked both Cape Air and DOT if there's anything that we should do to respond, they've both indicated that it's not necessary.
Okay.
So our existing public opinion stands, and that doesn't specifically address this issue, but it broadly says many of the same things you just verbalized.
Okay.
So it's just a wait and see process right now.
It is. So a week ago when I talked to DOT, they had told me that their revised timeline was to get this out by the end of last week. Obviously it didn't happen, so I'm expecting any day now.
Okay, good. Good. Yeah, that's quite a kicker into the process, isn't it?
It's been a distraction.
Yes, good way to put it, distraction.
Yes.
You know, we went through a pretty extensive process to pick out a carrier. And we did do some significant research to make sure that we are happy with whoever we're going to get. And we came up with Cape Air. So I think there's a lot of strength in terms of the process we went through, that it was a good process and it was a good selection too. So I would hope and assume that it will just disappear.
Right. And also, a little bit of thought on my side is that if Boutique is doing this kind of stuff now, what might have they done to us down the road
Um,
on different things?
I mean, in general, I concur with that line of thinking, is especially in an environment where the contract gets rebid every 2 years, the last thing you want to do is burn any bridges. And I think Boutique has possibly done that.
Correct,
So,
correct.
so moving on then to Cape Air, things.
Thanks for bringing that little tidbit up, Barry.
Yep. So things have kind of slowed down with Cape Air, obviously for the same reasons. I'm continuing to talk to them probably 2-3 times a week, but until they get officially awarded the contract, they really can't start expending money or doing things in the transition process. Because it looks presumptive on their part if they do start doing that, and they don't want to assume or come across to DOT as presuming anything and let DOT follow their DOT's process. So while we've been talking and doing some planning, there's a lot of things that once the award gets out there, because again, we've barely got, or just a little over 2 months, there's a lot of things that have to happen once that happens. So kind of on hold there, but there is, some things going on behind the scenes. On the marketing front, our normal marketing is all running for the summer. Our messaging is a little toned for the current environment. Basically what we're saying is when you're ready to fly, we're there. So we're not trying to encourage people to fly, or, we don't want to come across as ignoring the world we're in right now. But at the same time, we want to remind people that if you're thinking about it, we are an option. And, all the things that people have come to expect of us are there for them when they're ready. One of the things that I, kind of on that, Cape Air stuff, we've already kind of written the announcement that will go out in email to all of our existing email recipients as soon as that award goes out. So kind of some of the marketing pieces are already queued up to start getting things out there. But obviously until that's awarded, that can't go out. And then we're continuing working on our website redesign. We're targeting essentially that kind of going up the 1st of September, about a month before Cape Air's service start. And so we've got about 6 weeks of work left on that front. And I think that is my report. Does anyone have any questions on anything I've mentioned? Actually, I take that there are 2 things that I wanted to mention that I forgot to put in my report. Since our last meeting, I had a visit from, I can't think of his, Jason Allen, and he was joined with State Senator, I can't think of his name right now, out of Traverse City. But anyway, they actually flew in here on a private plane just to chat. And Jason Allen, who is basically the head of USDA Rural Development for our area, really was encouraging us as the airport to apply for grants and or loans through some of their various programs, because he believes we are well situated to receive additional funding through that organization to help us. And the two things that, well, one thing that he specifically mentioned was basically funding for marketing purposes. And I think with a new carrier coming in, we could use additional funds to really kind of make a bigger push for that transition. But in addition to that, we know that we've struggled to figure out how we're going to fund with our limited resources the updates to our T-hangers. And I think that's another project that we should try to figure out how we could put together a grant application for U.S. rural development funding for that project as well. So I just want to mention that I know USDA rural development has always been out there. It's just never seemed like a good fit to me. But when, the guy running the program comes in and tells you you would be a good fit per our grant rules, et cetera, it really opened my eyes that that's something I think I and we as a board need to move forward on. It doesn't hurt to spend a little bit of time to ask. The worst they can say is no.
Barry, is a lot of their money they loan out free of charge?
They have both grants and loan programs. So I think that's something.
Yeah.
We identify what things we want. I think we would work with USDA on finding the right program. Obviously, we'd want everything to be grants, but significantly low interest loans aren't necessarily a bad option, although historically the county has been willing to provide us zero interest loans, but that I don't think it's appropriate for us to assume that that is the case going forward, as the whole financial picture of local government is probably changing dramatically over the next few years.
Right.
Barry, those programs with the which program you're talking about there, would that include like T-hangers and things like that, improvements on that, or?
That is what I'm hoping to work with them on, is what program would be best suited for the most likelihood of us being successful in getting funding for that project, the T-hangers, yes.
Okay, all right. And then the other question I've got is, what's our status now on Ted Aaron's hangar? Anything changed, moved, or what?
That is later on the agenda.
Okay, sorry.
So
Mark, that's coming up.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just to add on to that, Barry, Jason is scheduled currently to be here on August 5th. Got a meeting at the casino. The senator that he would have been traveling with out of Traverse would be Wayne Schmidt.
Yep, that's it.
And the other thing of it is a lot of that stuff, taking advertising as an example, we do have advertising dollars already there. You can leverage those dollars to get much more coming out of the feds, regardless of whatever it is. That's kind of how a lot of that stuff works. But it does go from soup to nuts on some of this stuff, whether it's grant or loans. I do know the money, a lot of the money he has available right now is 2 1/8%.
Any other questions? Okay, then Jerry, I turn it back over to you. I'm done with my report.
Okay, well, thank you, Barry. Moving on, we've got old business, unfinished business, and it's something that Mark brought up, and I'll bring up now. Ted Aaron's hangar lease and transfer agreement. Barry has been working on that, and he does have a agreement put together here that he and Ted have worked on. And I'm going to let Barry go through it real quick. And then I'm in favor of us voting on it and saying, yes, let's go ahead and do it. Barry, any comments? Go ahead.
This agreement that is before you today is essentially the same agreement that the board had been considering back, I think it was December. And the only changes that were made are the date, the effective date of this being August 1st. Instead, back then we were looking at a April 15th date. And the prorated amount of rent for the year has been updated to $1,300 versus, I think it was actually blank in the previous agreement. But otherwise, this is the same agreement that the board saw back in December with those two changes. Ted's response to this was, looks good. I think he actually used 3 words and not 2, but I can't think of what the 3rd word is right now. So basically, this is just coming back to the board now that the capital committee has done a little due diligence in looking at the hangar, looking at the potential issues with the door, so that we kind of have an understanding, although not necessarily a crystal clear understanding, of the condition of the hangar that we are contemplating here, essentially acquiring.
Correct. Yes, we do still have the potential cost to do some repairs of the door. We're not sure exactly what type of repairs are required. It's going to take some kind of a little bit of disassembling, I'm understanding, to finger what kind of repairs are actually needed out there on the door. That's something I'm looking at that we'll go down the road to start working on once we get the hangar back to the airport property. So if there's discussion on it, let's go ahead and talk about it for a few minutes. And at the end of the discussion, I'd like to have a vote to say, yes, let's go ahead and have Ted sign off on this and get moving. Because this potentially is something that Cape Air is looking for to hangar their plane through the winter months.
And Jerry, I'll segue or, piggyback off of that comment. So there are 2 parties that have an interest in this hangar. One being the airline Cape Air, although because there isn't an award yet, that's detail that they just haven't really had the time or energy really to focus on. So they've not really thought about what they would pay for, what term, all of those details are just a minor detail to them in getting service started, but plays heavily potentially into our conversation as to how ultimately we move forward with this. So that's one interested party. The other is this maintenance firm out of Cadillac that has been out, looked at it. So there are different options for us going forward. But the key is that until we own it and have control of it, we're not in a position to direct any of that activity in a way that we find most beneficial for the airport overall.
Correct.
Okay, that brings up three things for me then. The purchase price, I think we've already got that figured out. Is that not true?
Basically, there is no amount of money exchanging hands here. We are basically receiving the hangar in an as-is condition. In exchange, we're providing Mr. Ahrens the use of one of our T hangars for storage, rent-free. And there are conditions around that in the future that might not be rent-free if we ever ran out of T hangars, and therefore he would start up to paying for that. But as of now, it would be rent-free as we have a surplus of T hangars. So there is no amount we're paying for this.
Okay.
And again, because this hangar was built as part of a ground lease to Mr. Ahrens, it would revert back to the airport anyway in about 12 years, I think.
Right.
So just
That's
taking
a
off.
ways down the road.
It is a ways down the road, but in some ways it's just moving forward that outcome of the future anyway. So
Is there an end date to how long he gets a free T hanger?
I believe it is the length of the original agreement. So that would be, that 12 years from now.
Right.
I believe you're correct on that, Barry.
Barry, I guess, I think just putting together an initial proposal and present it to the board, I think that'd be a good start. And, see if that's going to fly.
When you say initial proposal for what?
Well, to obtain the hangar and to work out arrangements in terms of the usage of the other hangars. I think that's part of the package.
All of that is in the agreement that I sent to you this morning.
Correct.
This morning. Okay,
Yeah.
I didn't. I'll have to check. I'll have to look at that. I haven't seen it.
Barry, can you put it up on the screen here?
I can do that, yes.
Show them what they're looking at.
Barry, this is Andrew.
Yeah.
On paragraph 0.1, there's a duplicate word, payments, right in the middle of that paragraph.
So the paragraph numbered one.
Numbered 1, the word payments is duplicated.
Yep, I see it.
Oh, I see it now, yes.
And then my other question is probably unlikely, but with what you just said about possibly getting some grants from USDA, if the airport was capable of getting funding to do the T hangars, do we need any language in this that states that the airport authority is allowed to perform upgrades and he will either have to move to another hangar or find other alternative space during that time?
There isn't language here for that, but I understand what you're saying, and yes, we would need to work through that process.
And I'm assuming any of the other tenants, you probably have to have some sort of arrangement up front if those renovations happen.
Yeah, I mean, again, our existing lease agreement doesn't talk about that, but it hasn't been an issue in the past when we've done improvements.
Because I think anybody that's out there in the existing T hangars, if we do make some improvements, there'll have to be some kind of discussion to allow them to move to another one. We'll make repairs to the one that they're presently housed in. Andrew, I don't see whether that's what you're talking about. It's a good point, but I don't know whether we want to confuse and complicate this piece of work or agreement with what you just mentioned.
No, and I don't want to delay this. I'm just, if,
Right.
you know, when we first talked about this, the discussion was there's really not funding and it's not going to happen.
Right,
But as Barry pointed out, if there's a potential for funding, then maybe just a verbal conversation or something, there should be some sort of notice. And like you said, the people that are in there now should be happy to just see improvements being made.
Yep. And the way we've approached that in the past, because when we updated the electrical and all of them, and also the floors, both were things that really required moving things out, is that we moved people generally into an adjacent hangar temporarily and then moved the contents of their stuff back. So we undertook the responsibility of that. So there was no cost on their part for us doing the work. And in general, it's not a lot to move an airplane and a few belongings, but in Ted's case, because it's being used for storage, that effort will be a little bit more. But I think it's reasonable for us to incur any labor to make that happen, as opposed to forcing that back onto the tenant to move their stuff twice. But you know, that's my opinion on that.
And nobody had any problems with like you moving there. When you start moving a plane, you kind of think, oh God, hopefully nothing goes wrong.
I mean, we move planes every day. That's
Okay,
part of what we do. So
sure.
no, that's not an issue.
good question, Karen. Somebody might have that problem, but anyway. So, any other comments, questions? If not, could I hear a motion to approve this, approve and sign off this airport hangar lease transfer agreement with Ted Aarons?
I'll make that motion.
I'll support it.
Okay,
I've got two requests on the motion. One being, I think the motion should include the correction of the typo, the payments. And actually on this one, that's actually the only comment I have. My other issue applies to the rest of the agreements, but not this one.
okay, whoever made that motion to approve this, can we go back and amend it just a little bit?
I can make the motion to approve the amended contract.
Okay, amended contract, okay. Second still goes?
Second, yes.
Okay. Julie, could we have a roll call, please?
Yeah, Barry, do I add in the motion that we also want to authorize the board chair to sign this?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's probably fine.
So
Yes.
do we have to re-motion it, or do I just add that in?
I'll reword the motion that I move that we approve the lease contract with the Aaron's hangar with the amended language correction and authorization for the board chair to sign it.
Okay, thank you.
Julie, a roll call now?
Mr. Dunce,
Yes.
Mr. Bergstrom,
Yes.
Mr. Suda,
Yes.
Mr. Haw,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Gentili,
Yes.
Ms. Goodman.
Yes.
Okay, moving on to new business. Barry, your additional documents that you passed out?
Yep. I'm going to bring them up. And
Oh, I finally found your boutique air letter in the file here.
yep, it was in the pile.
Oh, boy.
Okay, so there are 3 different grant documents that are the items under new business. The first 2 are very routine in nature. They are annual grants that we get from Michigan MDOT for both marketing support and support for capital items. So the first one, which is Grant 2020-0728, is our annual marketing grant. And it is for $10,000. It's a 90-10 grant. So it leverages $1,111 of funding that we're already spending on marketing, with an additional $10,000 then coming from the state. So again, this is a routine document. We have one of these every year, or actually there's 3. We get marketing. We generally have been getting a capital improvement, and then there's also a firefighting cost reimbursement grant. So there are 3 grants that we get annually under this state program. Now this is where my comment that I was going to mention on the previous one, but it didn't apply, but it does apply to this, is for all of these state grants, they are moving, well, actually they have moved away from using physical signatures, and they now going forward only support digital signatures. And I'm the one that is set up in their system to do digital signatures on behalf of the airport. So my request would be that in the motion that I be authorized to sign this document on behalf of the authority, because I'm right now the only one that can because of their new process.
Okay. Barry, do you want a separate motion for both of them, or?
I think there should be a separate motion, because Julie then needs to put together a resolution, and I think it's just clearer if each one has its own motion.
I have no problem with what you're requesting. Could we get a motion for the number 0728 grant that Barry just spoke about, and also authorizing him to do an electronic approval on it?
I'll make that motion.
Okay, thank you. Do I hear a second?
I'll second that.
Thank you. Julie, did you get all that?
I did.
Okay, we have a roll call, please.
Sure. Mr. Bergstrom,
Yes.
Ms. Goodman,
Yes.
Mr. Haw,
Yes.
Mr. Dantz,
Yes.
Mr. Suda,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Gentili.
Yes.
Okay, the next one is Grant 2020-0736. Same program, the Michigan Air Service program. This is the capital improvement subgrant. It is in the amount of $6,000. Again, a 90-10 split, so our share is $667. We requested this grant to pay for the remaining expenses of the PFAS testing equipment that were basically required to have hooked up to our fire truck. Last year, Eagle MDOT had a program that covered most of the costs. This is kind of to cover the remaining amount of that expense under this program. So again, I would request the same type of motion authorizing me to electronically sign this document.
I'll make that motion, Mark Bergstrom.
I'll second it. Julie, did you get that?
Yes, I did.
Okay, we have a roll call, please.
Yep. Mr. Gentili,
Yes.
Ms. Goodman,
Yes.
Mr. Suda,
Yes.
Mr. Haw,
Yes.
Mr. Bergstrom,
Yes.
Mr. Dance,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson.
Yes.
Okay, the next item is the CARES Act grant. The state is actually kind of a little bit overwhelmed with this CARES program because pretty much every airport in the state was ultimately awarded some money. Normally, the state process would have been for them to generate a grant agreement like what we just saw. That's kind of their standard template. But because they needed to do this fast and get one out for every airport in the state, they basically created a short mini version that's just this 3-page document that is basically our agreement with the state on receiving this funding through them. Because Michigan is a block grant state, that's kind of why you see here that this is technically a sub-grant. The state gets awarded the lump sum, and then they, through these sub-agreements, basically divide it out in the way it's been awarded to each airport. So this will be, again, for that $30,000. Its intended purpose is to offset operational expenses. But since we, have more than, or the equivalent of $30,000 of expenses almost on a monthly basis from an operational standpoint, we can then use those dollars that we would have spent operationally for other purposes, or none at all if we just want to build up our balances or rebuild our balances, as the case may be. So that's what this document is. And again, it's part of the new digital signature process, so similar language in the motion should apply.
Barry, this is still an unfinished document, correct? I'm asking because I guess the maximum obligation payment, that still has to be filled in. That's where the $30,000 goes?
Yes. Again, and they kind of sent out this single to every airport approval instead of generating an individual package for the 100 different airports in the state.
So when you'll get this back filled out then with the $30,000?
$30,000.
Okay. And how long do we have to use this?
I think 2 years.
Okay. Okay.
But there's no reason, as soon as it's approved, we couldn't submit for reimbursement because we have the operating expenses on a monthly basis that we can use as submittal for reimbursement under this.
Okay. Okay. Sounds good. Any further questions, comments by anyone? If not, could I hear a motion to have Barry again sign off on the 2020 CARES Act agreement, and also I presume this has to be electronically done again?
Correct. Yep.
Correct. Could I have a motion to that effect?
Okay, I'll do it. I'll move that we go ahead and allow him to proceed with the agreement, the 2020 CARES Act agreement.
Okay, I heard, thank you, Mark. I heard a
Yep.
support. Julie, did you get that?
The support was Mr. Gentile, correct?
Yes.
No.
Okay.
No or yes?
I'll
Yes.
support it, but somebody else spoke up first.
No, not Mr. Smuda. Smuda supported it, right?
Oh,
Bill did.
Okay. Okay, ready for a roll call?
Ready for a roll call.
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Ms. Goodman, Mr. Suda,
Yes.
Mr. Gentili,
Yes.
Mr. Bergstrom,
Yes.
Mr. Dunn,
Yes.
Mr. Haw.
Yes. Okay, Larry, that wraps it up on your end.
I am done. Thank you very much.
Okay, sounds good. As we wind down for this meeting here, any comments by board members? If not, I have no comments. Just again, thank you for signing in and thank you for participating, everyone. I thought it was a nice, quick meeting here and we covered a lot today. So with no further comments, I will say the meeting's adjourned.
Thanks, Jerry.
Okay, thank you.